Well, welcome everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Philip Goad, Chair of Architecture here at the University of Melbourne. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land on which we work, learn and live, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung peoples. And I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. As a co-director of ACAHUCH, the Australian Centre for Architectural History, Urban and Cultural Heritage, and my fellow ACAHUCH co-directors, Professors Julie Willis and Hannah Louie, I'd like to welcome everyone here to this evening's lecture and welcome to the faculty, Professor Johan Lagae, who is with us here as an ACAHUCH visiting scholar for nearly a couple of weeks, a little bit over. Johan's been presenting a series of talks and seminars to staff, students, and also here in the public. It's really an enormous pleasure for me to be able to introduce Johan. We met, and Johan told me the date, more than 25 years ago, actually in Houston, at one of the American Society of Architecture Historians annual meetings. And we've crossed paths ever since at various conferences in Europe and the US. And Johan also made it to Australia for a Sahan conference in Brisbane in 2000. Can anyone remember Brisbane? Yeah, something like that. But some more notes on Johan himself. He's a professor at Ghent University, where he teaches the history of 20th century architecture from a global perspective. He holds a doctorate in colonial architecture in the Democratic Republic of Congo and has published extensively on this subject, as well as on urban history in Central Africa, colonial built heritage and photography in post-colonial Africa. He's co-authored 2 books on the architecture and urban landscapes of Kinshasa and recently co-edited the volume African Modernism and Its Afterlives in 2022 with Nina Bere and Paul Wenzel Geisler. He's currently co-editor of the ABE journal, Architecture Beyond Europe. He's curated with others and contributed to several exhibitions related to Congo and Africa, such as La Mémoire du Congo, Le Temps colonial in 2005, À Chacun sa Maison, Housing in the Belgian Congo, 1945 to 60 in 2018, and Style Congo, Heritage and Heresy in 2023. He's also collaborated with several artists from the Democratic Republic of Congo, most recently with Sami Bologgi on the project ACAHUCH, The Future That Never Was, shown at the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2023. And Johan gave a talk on that topic to our students in the MSD. Johan has benefited from several grants. He's held a Franqui Chair at the Université Libre de Brussels in 2020 and was resident at the Institut des Études Avancées in Paris in 2019. This evening, the title of his lecture is Who Builds Your Concrete Monsters? The Geopolitics of Concrete in Mobutu's Congo-Zaïre. Please welcome Johan Lagae.
Thank you all for the invitation, and I would also like to pay my respects for the first people on whose land we gather this evening, as well as pay tribute to the first people of the land on which the building that I will discuss is standing. So what I will do this evening, I will talk about one very particular building, but I will do that from a multitude of perspectives. And I want to start with a disclaimer saying that this is not my personal work, it's part of kind of collaboration with postdocs, with PhDs, with students. So we have the advantage in our Ghent University Architecture Engineering program to be able to work with students on the topics that we're working on as researchers. So stuff that you will see this evening is partly also done in collaboration. And it's part of a large research project I'm going to discuss tomorrow. More and more detail, construction history above and beyond, and this is the website, so if you're interested, you can go to the link. It's a project that brings together colleagues from the universities of Brussels, so both the Flemish and the Francophone University and Ghent University. So bringing together construction historians together with people vested in particular domains of history, so the history of urbanization, the history of legal history, and colonial history. And so we are working with 6 supervisors, 4 PhD students, and 4 postdocs and 3 PhD students. So it's a big project. And so what I'm going to present this evening is something that is linked very much to this particular research project, but also ties in with the larger research that I've been doing over the last 2 decades. And so it's something that, of course, is also embedded in a kind of more international term. So you could say over like 3 decades, we have seen scholarship emerging on colonial architecture, both in Africa and elsewhere. So these are a couple of books, some of which have really marked my own trajectory as a researcher. And more recently, you could say there has been a kind of growing attention for what is called the architecture of independence, so post-1960 architecture in Africa. And you could say part of that interest, especially in those scholars who take a kind of stylistic kind of entry point, is coming out of this kind of interest in brutalist building worldwide. So this project you might both know is Brutalism, which is both a website, was an international conference, and a 2-volume publication documenting what is supposedly to be the brutalist architecture that we see all over the world. And of course, this term brutalism is a very problematic one. So in one of the books, Johan Lagae is doing a very good job at unpacking the kind of uncritical use of that term. So I'm referring to this concrete monstrous as a kind of clander to this kind of project. So this is one part of what I want to do with the building that I'm going to discuss. The other part is contributing to something that Adrian Forty in his book Concrete and Culture has called, has called the geopolitics of concrete. So instead of understanding concrete as a kind of generic building material, he makes an argument why we should consider concrete as something very situated, something very localized. So he says concrete's ingredients, not cement, because he sees that as a kind of generic material, but then labor, steel, and aggregates make it local. And you could even argue that cement is much more localized and situated than he is saying. But so what happens if you bring this geopolitics of concrete, which he discusses among others by looking at Brazil and Japan, what happens if you would bring that to Congo? That's what I want to do. So that's another dimension, an entry point. And another one is, and that's because I was actually struck when I was looking at this recent scholarship, that it very seldomly discusses how these buildings are actually being built. So one of the questions I'm wanting to ask is who builds your concrete monsters? And so who is actually doing that? Who is involved? What is the division of labor? What are the production modes involved? So these are questions that I'm interested in. And so it's looking at some of the work that is being done by this collective. And it's also looking at this kind of recent re-emerging interest in Ferro, who you might know. So he's a Brazilian architect who in the 70s and 80s was running a research lab at the University of Grenoble in France, looking very much at construction as an entry point throughout architectural history. And so recently there has been a big project of translating his texts from French and from Portuguese into English. So this is a book, and recently has been a 2nd volume out. And so what interests me here is what he calls the muck down below. And so how can we look at the building site and also attach value to the labor that is involved in the construction site, because he says this is often not being done. And so the labor on the construction site is not seen as a kind of source of value. So what I'm doing is like sketching out a bit the kind of positions and the kind of literature with which I'm in dialogue and looking at this particular building. And another name, which I don't know if that will ring a bell, but Thomas van Leeuwen, who is a Dutch architectural historian. You might know him from his first book, The Springboard and the Pond. But he's a very interesting guy who just published a couple of months ago this book, The Thinking Foot, a pedestrian study of paving. So it's someone who, and this is what I really like about his work, has this mildly idiosyncratic methodology that is to look at the building, unpacking then the building, first stripping down the architectural object to its smallest possible particle, and then fanning out to the widest possible ramification. So this is something that I will try to do in the building I'm going to discuss today. And this idea and this interest in the smallness is something that I want to bring in construction history, because construction history very often is a story about innovation and technological progress. So what happens if you look at the mundane, the small, the banal? And so it's also bringing some of these ideas of this recent book by Swati Chattopadhyay, so this small spaces recasting the architecture of empire. what would happen if you bring that kind of thinking to the field of construction. So this is some of the stuff I'm currently engaged with. So you could say, in this sense, what I'm trying to do is very much part of the EOS project, which is trying to recalibrate to some extent this field of construction history. And it all started, you could say, in 2013, when a very important Belgian construction firm, Blaton, donated a huge amount of archive to the CIVA, which is the Centre International pour la Ville et l'Architecture in Brussels, a very important archival institution for architecture. And so they dumped a huge amount of material, and Maurice Culot, who was then the director, gave me a phone call and said, look, you're having this huge amount of material, and there's a lot of stuff on Africa. Are you interested? And I said, yes, of course, Maurice, very interested. And so together with a student, we worked on making a first inventory. So what you see on the left is actually the part of the huge archive which is devoted to the African activities of Blaton. So it's almost 100 running meters of archives. It's immense. And so the Blaton had a branch which is called the Compagnie Congolaise de Construction. So it's a company that arrived in Congo in the late 1940s and was active until the mid-1970s, which makes it a very interesting actor because it goes from the late colonial to the early post-independence period. And so for the first time, we actually had like a good source material to think about stuff that is going on under the under the regime of Mobutu, which is quite exceptional. And so the building I'm going to talk about is actually also from the late 60s. So that was like a trigger. And so what we did is, based on this archive, we mounted a research project. The brilliant PhD student, Robbie Fivi, who is now part of the team of the EOS research project. So he did a PhD called The Concrete State, Construction Materials and Building Ambitions in the Belgian Congo. So he's very much part of this conversation. And then another conversation partner is Monika Motylinska from the Leibniz Institute for Research on Society and Space in Erkner, which is a city not that far from Berlin. And she's doing this large research project called Conquering with Concrete, German construction companies as global players in local contexts. And so I'm linked as a kind of external consultant to this project. So this is the kind of milieu in which this building I'm going to talk about is situated. And it's of course situated in a huge amount of like emerging literature on all things construction history related, but also new scholarship on materiality and these kind of things. And I will come back to a number of these books in the talk. But I want to go back to what is a kind of foundational moment in the discipline of construction history, which is this quote from John Summerson. It says, and this is really the beginning, so it's something that was published in the first issue of the journal Construction History, so the UK-based journal, so in 1985. He says, okay, what is the study of the history of construction? What is that exactly? You could say it can be the history of structural design, but it can also be the history of building practice. And what I'm interested in is much more the second thing. So I'm much more interested in the history of building practice, which he says involves the total process of getting a building up on the site, including everything from the recruitment of labor, selections of materials, transport of materials and equipment on the site, down to the supply of drawing materials for the office, the method of payment to builder and architect, and so on and so on. It's a history of a complicated process, always in a state of change, in which it is the historian's business to investigate and expound. And so this, for us, is a very important starting point in the research field. So what I'm going to do is bring that to a very specific building, which is this one, and reading that building not as an object, but as an assemblage. And it's this building. So it's the building that still exists today, which is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And this is a quite interesting case. Why? Because we have a huge amount of archival material. We have archives of the architect, and the good thing is it's all in the same institute. So we have 2 boxes coming out of the archive of the architect, and we have 30 boxes coming out of the archive of the construction firm who actually built it. And so this material is very diverse in nature. So it has some drawings of the architect in his fund, and then a lot of technical correspondence, detailed concrete plans, a couple of photographs, which I'll come back in a minute, and very interesting but awkward kind of documents with which we as architecture students often do not work. And so one of the things that we have been doing, and I've been doing this together with Robbie, is trying to figure out how you work with an archive of a construction film. But it often has this kind of documents that we don't have this kind of like feeling for. Okay, so this is the building and the sources. And this is the kind of like broad sketch that I want to do. So I will situate that building both in the kind of political context of its time, talk about where it is situated, and then I will go into detail about how it was actually built. Ending with the question of how is the archive actually an oracle? So that's what I want to do. So let's start why this building looks like it does, and what does that say about the politics of the time. And let's start with this drawing. This is a 2008 drawing by contemporary Congolese artist called Macgeorge. It's actually a map he made for a French scholar in order for her to navigate the city. So you see a kind of bird's eye view of the, you could say, urban landscape of the city. You have like a small vocabulary kind of dictionary of what you would need in the street if you run into a police officer, for instance, and you have kind of indication of the geography of the city, which also has this kind of newspaper cutting that says something about the lack of provision of electricity in the city. So it's a very interesting kind of layered map. But what is very striking in the bird's eye view is that it has this very strong emphasis on the vertical. And so Dominique Malaquais, who is actually the French scholar for which this map was made, writes about this map that what you see in this map is the spectre of Mobutu. So the ghost of Mobutu is actually coming out of this map in the sense of how he recreated very interesting parts of the city. So a number of these buildings are actually part and parcel of Mobutu's effort of changing the skyline of Kinshasa from a colonial capital city to the capital city of independent Congo-Zaïre. And so you could say that the building I'm talking about is very much part and parcel of that exercise. So it's really the moment when Mobutu comes to power, which is 65. So Congo gets its independence in 1960. 5 years later, Mobutu was power, and he will remain in power until the late 1990s. And he comes up with this policy of what he calls a recours à l'authenticité. So drawing on the legacy of the ancestors, which is a message that he will articulate in a very famous speech in 1973 at the United Nations headquarters in New York, but also in Dakar, where he says, okay, we as an independent people, we refuse to embrace any longer the ideologies that are imported, and we want to embrace the legacy of the ancestors. So very much the message. And you could say cultural politics are really a crucial instrument for him. So Sarah van Buren made this beautiful book, Authentically African, where she writes extensively about the cultural politics of Mobutu, and Ruth Sachs, who is a Johannesburg-based scholar / artist, really recently published this book, Congo Style, from Belgian Art Nouveau to African Independence, where she also talks about how architecture becomes part and parcel of that exercise. And so that work of Ruth Sachs really resonates with the kind of research that we do. And you could say it's, of course, something that is not only happening in Congo, it is happening in many independent countries where the shaping of capital cities becomes really an instrument of policy making and nation building. But interestingly, in the Congolese context, what you have is that you have this recours à l'authenticité policy, and that you have an Italian architect who was teaching at the architecture school in Kinshasa at the time, who published very rare to find books actually. So Essai d'architecture authentique, in which he develops, you could say, kind of architectural theory for what this recours à l'authenticité could mean for shaping that new landscape of buildings and city. Where you could argue that his plea for these sculptural buildings makes concrete as liquid stone the ideal material to work with. And so this is the kind of architecture you end up with. This is the stuff that gets built under Mobutu's regime. And so the building that we will see, you could say, is partly part of this kind of production. So you have quite amazing concrete constructions at the time. So also from an engineering point quite very, with interesting actors. So this guy was really a key player, Olivier Clément Calcoup, French-Tunisian architect, very closely connected to the high political establishment in France, but also working very closely for a number of leaders in various independent African countries in the 70s, among which Mobutu. And you have the similar kind of exercise of rethinking the master plan of the city. So Mobutu invites French planning experts to make a new master plan for Kinshasa, which will take like a 10-year kind of study, so from the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s. And this architecture very much fits this idea of Mobutu of being the chief. So he presents himself as the chief of the village who speaks to the people. And so this is very much the kind of rhetoric. And so it's not a coincidence that this building, which is the National Television and Broadcasting Company building, is one of the first really big buildings to get to be built, financed by French money, with French architects and French construction firms. So this is the kind of context in which these things work. And so this is something that we have worked on with students for a number of years now. Okay. Now, why is then this building interesting? We know it today as a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but it was actually, the origin of that building is something different. And it's a document in the archive that unveiled it. It's this document. It's like the first document that talks about the Commission. So it states that in 1956, this building is actually being built as the headquarters for the United Nations in Congo, which is interesting because politically, you might know, I mean, when Congo becomes independent, I'm going to perhaps go to the next slide. So what you have is this very famous speech of Patrice Lumumba in 1960, on the day that independence is declared. You get 5 years of political turmoil. So the Katanga region, which is the mining region, which was the economic driver of the Belgian colonial project, that province claims its own independence from independent Congo. So 11 days after the independence of Congo, Katanga declares its own independence with the support of the United States and Belgium, very much involved, because that's where all the minerals are and that's where the real money is. And so you get 5 years of political turmoil. Patrice Lumumba gets murdered in 1961. And so there's a huge, it's like the first peacekeeping mission of the United Nations is actually in independent Congo. So that means that there was a very strong military presence. And this document from the archive talks about that. It says in 1956, what we see is the importance of the military presence of the United Nations is diminishing, but what is augmenting is the presence of the technical services of the United Nations, so technical aid in the field of education, healthcare, these kind of things. And so what we need, this document makes a plea for, is a building that can combine the offices of all these administrations. That's the idea. That's the initial idea and origin of the project. And that is because these offices and these administrations are scattered all over the city. So one of the main places where they're situated is this amazing residential block of the 1950s. That's where part of the UN guys are actually residing and having their office. And it's an interesting site because it's really located, so it's located here. And this, you could say, is the axis of political power of the colonial capital city. This is where you have all the public administration. So these huge buildings is where the services of the colonial administration were situated. And this building, which you can't see well, was designed as the residence of the Governor General. So you're really you're looking at the seat of colonial power. And so what Mobutu will do is actually choose this site as the future site for this United Nations headquarters. That's the idea. So that's the first site plan that we find in the archives. So you see, this is the Palace of Justice. The residence building is here, and this is the residence of the Governor General. So this gives you an idea of the kind of setting we are looking at. And in that sense, you could say that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is here to be seen on a site plan, is complementing the unfinished project of that monumental axis of the colonial capital city. a project that has been a dream of architects and planners. So what you're seeing here is a late 1940s proposal from a Brussels-based architect who was working for the colonial government. So this is his scheme for this monumental axis. What I have seen so far is this part, but he actually designed something that would surpass the Champs-Élysées in Paris in scale. To give you an idea of the kind of obsessions that some of these people had. Not the guys in Brussels who needed to pay for it, but the guys on the ground. And so the Governor General is very much in favor of this plan. And of course, a typically Belgian situation, it becomes a very scattered kind of unfinished project. And so here, actually, this new headquarters of the United Nations should be built. And you could say this immediately also becomes the kind of site of, you could say, the seat of power of the post-independence period. So this is an interesting painting from a very famous, what is called a popular painter, Chibumba Kanda Matulu, who depicts the building that is actually the residence of the Governor General as a kind of very important site for political decisions after independence. It's also the place where Lumumba made his famous speech. And so that building immediately becomes appropriated as kind of very important political site for independence Zaire. Okay, so it's designed as a headquarters of the United Nations, but 3 years later, so we're 68, we see that it all of a sudden has changed function. So it has become the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's not yet very clear where that change comes from, so that's something that we're still investigating. What is interesting and why am I showing this is because that means that the United Nations all of a sudden becomes invisible again in the landscape. So if you go today to Kinshasa, there's still a very strong presence of the United Nations, still a very strong presence of a peacekeeping force because of what is happening in the eastern part of Congo, where actually the Third War is going on, World War is going on. So this eternal conflict between Rwanda, Burundi, and Congo. And so all over the city, you will see this. But these are actually the sites of the United Nations administrations that are there. So very anonymous kind of buildings behind big walls, barbed wire. And so this idea of having a kind of landmark building to become headquarters is something that wasn't realized yet. If you go to the imaginary of Congolese, you could say everybody knows that the United Nations is present in the city. And so one way to explain it is this quite remarkable model that was made by Boris Isaac Kindres, who's probably one of the most famous Congolese artists. He was discovered in the late 1980s, who made this kind of model of a potential UN building in Kinshasa. So as part of this kind of imaginary city of Kinshasa du troisième millénaire. All right, so the United Nations are something that was very important, but today it remains invisible. Why do I need the United Nations? Because the guy who actually designed the building was part of the United Nations. So this is the first drawing that we have where you see the names of the designers. So a French engineer, Félix Lafort, then Daniel Fizard and Nabil Badeau, French architects who were part of the United Nations. And then this guy who is the key designer, Eugène Palombo, a Sicilian-born architect who was heading the branch of the UNESCO in Congo in the 1960s. And so he's the key player. And so in that sense, this work brings us back to the kind of scholarship that we see emerging on this kind of notion of the global expert. So on which Tom Avermaet and others have been writing, or this kind of interest in UNESCO and in these kind of global networks of expertise that operate in post-independence periods. So I've written a bit on that as well. So we did a number in the Shift for Ape journal. It's work that we see popping up at Lucas Stanek, but also in French schools have done research like that. And I had the advantage of having a very good PhD student who looked at school building programs in post-independence Africa and looking at where the money comes from. So she was looking at the funding from the European Fund for Development, the UNESCO, and the World Bank. And so for me, that was a really eye-opening research because I thought I knew most of the architects who work on the African continent, and it turned out not to be the case. So she found a whole bunch of other people who were off the radar, who were not in the architecture journals, but doing really important work. One of them is Eugène Palumbo. So he was actually a guy working for the UNESCO, and UNESCO is very strong in their school building program. So it had both a kind of content-wise approach and what education should be, but also a very explicit and articulate position about architecture. And so Palumbo was a guy, and you see him here. He was very young at the time. Him on a building site. So he was running an office with a couple of Congolese draftsmen. Actually was supposed to do the policy work, but he did actually quite some buildings as well. He worked for UNESCO until the 68, 69, then became an independent architect and one of the key players in the architecture scene of the time. Did major work for Mobutu. So some of the buildings, huge projects, not all of them being realized, but give you an idea of the kind of work that he was doing. Associated himself with Talangai, who is the first generation of Congolese architects that were trained in Brussels, but really started them to work on the architecture scene. So this is Palumbo, a Sicilian guy working in Kinshasa until the late 1990s, actually. Baudot and Vizard are French architects, so they are part of this French effort of keeping their sphere of influence on the African continent by investing also in construction industry and planning and so forth. And so they become architects who also in a couple of African countries do work. This is a project they also did for Kinshasa, kind of assembly hall, which again never was built, but as you can see from the drawings from the Platon archive, really developed in detail. And then when we were doing research in Kinshasa and local archives, because of course part of the archives is still locally held. So this is the consultation room of the National Archives. This is the archive of the Office de Transport, so the transportation industry. And so we found in these archives, we found by chance a drawing that also gives us other names. Marcello Tolleri, who's an Italian architect, very much invested in the scene. And then a Belgian named Libre, who actually is a just retired professor from the University of Leuven, who started his career in Congo. So it's very thankful when I gave him photographs of the plan on which he worked as a young student. Anyhow, so that gives us a number of people involved in the design. But what is interesting in the Platon archive is that we also see who is involved in actually making the building stand. So we get to see the engineers. And so one of the reasons why we got interested in the building in the first place is, of course, this quite spectacular roof, which is, you could say, also testifying of a kind of professionalization of the construction industry market at the time. So what you have there is a very competitive market where Solel Bonech, I don't know if the name rings a bell, but it's a very important Israeli firm that was really tapping into the African market in the 1960s, 70s. Astaldi, an Italian firm, already present on site in Kinshasa in the 1950s. Really big firms with a lot of expertise. So Platon, it's not that obvious that Platon got the commission to do this work. You could say that it has partly to do with the fact that they have been on site already since the late 1940s, but also they have a very peculiar and specific expertise in pre-stressed concrete. So they are known as being professional builders when it comes to complex concrete constructions. So this is the work that Robbie actually did in his PhD. And there is a link, a very specific link with my alma mater, with Ghent University. So they work together with one of the key researchers in concrete technology. I don't know if this name rings a bell, Gustave Maniel. In terms of pre-stressed concrete, this is an internationally renowned expert. And so he was working as a consultant for Platon and the company Congolese Reconstruction. Okay, so what we have here is an early design where you see the folded roof plates that is covering the assembly hall. And what you see in the beginning is that it has a portico. And an internal letter in the archive, so these are like early drawings. And internal correspondence between the Platon guys, so the offices in Brussels and Kinshasa, say, look, we cannot calculate this thing. So it is this non-prismatic and continuous folded roof plate that brings us in what we call the realm of the unknown. And so if you look at technical research at the time. So you have these proceedings of the International Association for Shell Structures. Indeed, this is something that is being discussed at the time. How do you calculate a thing like this? And the way it's designed by the architect brings them into a kind of impossible thing. So they start to discuss, and so they try to find people who could actually calculate this. So one name that pops up is, of course, Nervi. Because Nervi is supposed to be the guy who can do all of these things. Nervi was actually active in Africa at the time. So he was doing big projects also in Abidjan, for instance. So he's someone who's on the radar. And so there's recent scholarship on Nervi in Africa. But in the end, they go back to Ghent University, where you have people researching these kind of calculations. And so till today, there is a strong kind of structural engineering department in which we work together. And so when I was a student, I actually had to study these books. The calculation of books, I hated it when I was a student. So now at least I'm a bit familiar with kind of literature. But it's interesting to see that all of a sudden this link pops up. And this link is interesting because Ghent University, the structural engineering department of Ghent University, has a link with Congo. And it has a link with Congo through these kinds of professors who are not only professors at university, but also consultants. And so these guys were doing consultancy work for big concrete structures in Kinshasa. So for instance, this is a building of the mid-1950s. It's the main terminal where all the boats coming from the inland with goods and people arrive in Kinshasa. And so that structure was actually designed by the office, transportation office, but calculated by a Ghent-based engineer. And so in the archives of the ministry, we found these plans. And so this is Robbie, the PhD student. This is actually the former director of the concrete lab of Ghent University, so who came with us on the mission. And so we found the books of Manuel in libraries and a technical library in Kinshasa. So that shows this kind of connection. Okay, but so they cannot calculate the thing. And that's what they say in January 69. So they asked Palumbo to redesign the thing. So Palumbo redesigns it. He goes for a cantilevered solution, and all of a sudden they say, now we can actually build this. So we know how to calculate this. And they outsource this new scheme, which is, so it's you have a series of columns here and a series of columns here. So this is the assembly hall, this is the cantilever. We're talking about 13 to 15 meters, so it's quite daring. And so they outsource it to two engineers who at the time are working for the University of Liège in the Francophone part of Belgium. And they say, we will use finite element methods, which is really early. So this is really the moment when this method starts to become used. And so in the archive, what we have is technical drawings, which allows us to do the complete geometry. We have a number of calculations, not only of the roof, but also from other parts of the buildings, a number of porticos. And so together with that material, we worked with a student and a structural engineer of Ghent University to do a kind of analysis of how clever is this solution. And it turned out it was actually quite good for the time. So this is what recent software analysis shows you. And so it's still standing today. So when they were putting away the scaffolding, it only like bent a little bit, but actually it was really well designed and well built. So that's interesting. So in terms of kind of construction history, interest, you could say this is a very spectacular but interesting kind of thing. What we started to understand is there's a very different way of looking at this building, not from the spectacular side, but from the mundane, the banal, the everyday, the small components. Because in the archive, what we also have is what is called the bande de commande, which allow you to map supply chains. So it's the procurement document. So you get all the components, we know where they come from, which companies were involved. And so together with two students, we did a kind of mapping that Kyle Moe did for the Empire State Building in New York. We're trying to understand, okay, what is the kind of global connection of this building? It's of course looking at some of this work that Jane Hutton has done on these reciprocal landscapes. And so what happens if you start to do that kind of analysis? So this is the work that the students did. So from authentic to terrestrial, unpacking the architecture of Congo-Zaïre. So they looked at all these bond commands, made a kind of synthetic drawing, and then together we selected a couple of elements. So they did a whole mapping of all the bond commands, made kind of Excel sheet and then a kind of geography and of these supply chains, which are interesting because they show us both like Belgian industry involved, but often through their branches in Kinshasa, but also American stuff coming in. So, for instance, these acoustic ceiling panels. And so here comes my fascination for the small. So Van Leeuwen and Chateaupoudai. So what happens if you look at small components, not at the spectacular concrete roof, but what happens if you look at small components? What kind of stories are we able to tell? Interesting is to look at the roof elements of this small, not very spectacular part of the building. Because what we have here, and this is what the bond command learners, we have what is called bac autoportant, self-supporting roof elements, which might ring a bell because in the archive what we find is bac autoportant designed by Jean Prouvé. And interestingly enough, so it's these kind of elements. And if you really want to do a study on Prouvé in Africa, I would invite you to look at the widespread use of the bac autoportant instead of the much more well-known misanthropique. Because I think if you really want to stand the massive impact of Prouvé, it's the louvers and the bac autoportant, not that complete unit. But so what is interesting in this case is that these bac autoportants are not made in aluminium, but in copper. Because copper is a widespread, of course, resource. And so we have like the company of which was involved in doing zinc cuivre, bac autoportant, cuivre, totally bac autoportant. Quite fascinating. Because this allows us again to, if you think of who is building our concrete monsters, to bring a whole range of other people to the fore, the workers and these kind of companies. So we do kind of business history kind of research, trying to find information on who is Latrica, what kind of firm is that. You can also find documentation about the labor, how laborers were actually accommodated. We also start to see in NATO documentation how Congolese rise in the structure of the company, become members of the board. So you get this kind of story that you can start to infer. Okay, so this is one way of how the small gives you wider ramifications. Another small element is not the roof itself, but the wood that is used for the formwork. So we have a bon de commande, and you see that these are very banal documents. So it's one letter, Sokubamel, plan de coffrage. So the wood we need for the formwork. What's the delay? It's very urgent, so we need it immediately. And then the payment will be done in 30 months. So these kind of very banal documents in the archive. But if you start using those kind of documents, what you all of a sudden get is a history of logging of wood. And so Robbie, in his postdoc trajectory, is starting to look at these logging concessions. Very interesting stuff, because that brings you to looking at landscapes, that brings you to looking at deforestation. So we mapped at students the sites where wood was logged in those days. This is another part. This is something that Robbie is looking into. So this is the Bas-Congo, the lower Congo region. So this is the Congo River. We are quite close to the ocean, and this is a railway running up to the north, and along that railway we have concessions of logging, and this is interesting. Why? Because the wood that is, the plywood that is used in the Beam house actually comes from Congo, which is, so if you start to look at the production mode, the labor kind of conditions, you get a very different story of Beam's houses and 50s modernism, if you do this kind of work. So this is what Robbie is actually doing. And it's, of course, tying in with something that I discovered in 2010 when I was working with a photographer, and I, for the first time, really was confronted with these kind of photographs that show the devastation transformation of a landscape under early colonial efforts. And so that ties in also with work that anthropologists are doing. So this is a fantastic book by an anthropologist, Thomas Hendricks, on contemporary logging in Congo. he, as an anthropologist, lived for months in one of these logging concessions and started to try to think as loggers, as he explains. And this is Sami Balochi, so a contemporary artist, his latest film, Libre de l'authenticité, so this idea of the ecological turn, of the non-human agency, is very much part of that work. So again, for a very small kind of object coming to these wide ramifications. Third example is, again, a very banal element. It's a door of an office. So again, another very exciting drawing. So the door frame, but it has an interesting word on it, Porte Glazelle. I don't know if the name rings a bell. Glazelle is a kind of brand name. But it's, so this is the drawing in more detail. So it's really a very basic kind of scheme. But this is interesting because Glazelle is a signature building component of 1950s, 60s landscape in Brussels and all over Belgium. So it's this, what is actually what construction historians have described as asbestos cement paneling. So it's, so this is a very interesting book. It's also a website, so post-war building materials. So this is this description in French, but so it's an asbestos paneling, which is on two sides covered with enamel. And it's really a signature element of 50s modernism. So this for me is interesting because this is a building of Claude Laurence, who is an architect I worked on quite a lot, who was very active in Congo as well. And so this is really a typical kind of image of the time. It's publicity for Glazelle, so it was all over the place. And you see, of course, also Eternit. Maybe that name rings a bell, I'm not sure. But if not, I advise you to read the work of Hannah Leroux, who has been working on this asbestos history. And so the kind of toxicity, so doing that from a South African perspective, but very much looking at Eternit in Switzerland. She's very much interested in knowing more about Eternit in Belgium and in Congo. So we are in conversation. So again, starting from a very small element and coming to wider ramifications that speak about debris and toxicity. And so in the case of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, what we have is that the asbestos is not coming out of South Africa, but is coming out of a mine in Canada. And so again, we can do the tracking of this. We can start to map the kind of extraction site. And so you can track, and then so Robbie has done that for a cement factory in Kinshasa. So tracking the kind of holes and scars in the landscape at these kind of extractions. So again, from a very small component coming to these very important and unsettling stories. Unsettling because, of course, what you have is the debris of that asbestos, which is still on the ground. And so students got into contact with a Congolese scholar who is doing work on the kind of health issues that this asbestos is actually leaving on the ground, very similar to what Hannah is doing for the South African case and for a township like Guatemala. So writing these histories of these building components becomes really something where you can start to think of what Anne Storer invites us to do, to think of the rot that remains. This is very much what the story is about. Okay. Furnishing a concrete monster. Through the Platon archive, how much? 5-10 minutes? Or 10 minutes? Okay. They're like really interesting decorative panels, again in copper. But what I'm interested in is, and that's something that I found out only quite recently, so what I'm showing you is very fresh kind of reflection. You can think of this as a kind of diplomatic interior. And I'm referring to this kind of work, so the politics of furniture, but also this very exciting book by Paul Gattolini. So what happens if you start to look at the interior design of the space? What is quite interesting is, and it's something that I got my hands on by chance, actually. So this is a commercial brochure of a company called New Form, Dakuya Sika. Is it was called in Lingala? Run by a Polish lady called Aleksandra Koszynski. And so it's this lady. So it's late 60s, early 70s kind of interior design in Kinshasa. Really fascinating stuff. Because they not only do this, and so this is the couple. So the guy was a chemical engineer. It's not very clear how he ended up. So I have a Polish PhD student. He thinks it's a kind of military spy. So we are unpacking the story as we speak. You can see that their pet animal is a snake. So it's a couple that is really a bit strange. The guy wrote a kind of memoir, which is also a very weird book. So he compares it to a modern version of Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness. My PhD student who read it during the holidays was like, what is this? Yeah. Very strange. But this is the kind of stuff that they do. And so they work for like the high-end real estate market at the time, doing villas for the political but also the military establishment, also the interior refectory for military bases in Kinshasa, and also designed what was at the time apparently the most famous nightclub in Kinshasa. So something that we need to unpack further. But again, if you ask the question, who is building your concrete monsters, all of a sudden these people pop up. So the workers that were employed by the new form. Again, people who we don't know anything about for the moment. But so it's like, again, a kind of lead that we would like to follow. And that brings me to my laptop is out, okay. Very weird stuff. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so this is something that we would like to know more. Okay, so this idea of looking at furniture as an entry point is something that for us is becoming important also for other projects. I can't go into detail. But so the key thing, and that's where I'm almost going to end, is okay, we're looking at building this concrete monster. We have this huge amount of material, and yet there is a huge silence in the archive. We don't know anything about the construction side. So one of the things that is very frustrating, so we have a lot of correspondence, but these are the things that we find on the construction site. It's telegrams between the Kinshasa-based guy who is running the site and the office, and it's extremely concise. So it's not giving you the muck from below as Ferro would like us to discuss. In terms of photographs, we have very little evidence of the building site. So this is part of the photographic, it's almost a complete photographic documentation we have on the large multi-story. And this is the one photograph we have of the assembly hall, and where you see the foundations being built and the first wall, the formwork of the first wall that is going to hold up part of the roof. And this is the only photograph that we have of the roof being built. So if you zoom in, you start to see the muck from below. But it's very hard because it's not a very high resolution image. And if you zoom in, we find these kind of things. So it's copper cladding, and here we still have the formwork. So if you go back to the technical drawings, what we do have is these kind of details. So where you see that you have a very thin kind of plate, and then an extremely exquisite kind of formwork, but also the rebars. So, and you need to do this with an immense sense of detail and a sense for execution, because structurally this needs to be a stiff note. If not, the whole thing falls apart. So that brings us to the question of skill. And so 14 in his book, Concrete and Culture, has written about skill or no skill, making the argument that concrete construction allows you to enable a kind of de-skilling, because no other means of construction allows such a satisfactory separation of the mental from the manual elements of labor. That's how he looks at construction. Construction historians will say, we don't buy into this. So one construction historian I think is a great scholar is Christine Wall. She's worked on the London South Bank and the Barbican. And she says we need to think of skill quite differently. And so she says of all the construction occupations, Concreting is the one that relies considerably on social interaction and teamwork. Because it's about responsibilities of equipment, machines, material training, practical expertise, judgments based on the basis of experience. So this is the big question for us. How do we deal with that if we don't have the archival material? So should we do an oral history project? Probably all the laborers no longer are with us. So this muck from below, which we think is really important, is something that we are stuck with. And so in that sense, we're in dialogue with other scholars who are working on this. So Maria Gonzalez Penda recently did this conference in the States, Labor Unimagined. So quite a number of people are starting to look at this. So we are very much hoping to do the same. So we're working with Christine Wall and Nina Clark. I've become a friend of the EOS project, which is nice. I mean, it's great to have such people on board. But the Plateau archive doesn't give us a lot. So this is one of the very rare documents where, for instance, what you see is a kind of what we think is a payment day on the construction side, and a list with names of people. But these are like snippets in the archive. So the big question is, how do we get to the person you see here and from the pilotis of a 1950s fascinating tropicalist building. The reason why I'm showing you this photograph is this is a photograph I discovered when I was doing my PhD, and I never paid attention to it. And I showed it to Christine Wall, and she said, "What a great picture." And that picture for me encapsulates a lot of the questions I've been discussing here in this talk. So is the archive an oracle? Yes, it is. And I think I'm not going to jump. So what I think is really crucial, and so the exhibit that we want to do about this project will be very much not only about this building, but very much about the archive as a kind of source and the limits of it. So it's thinking with some of the scholarship of Stover and other people. And it's going again back to 40. So learning how to listen to the archive and try to make sense of what it doesn't speak about. So what we are trying to think of for the moment is a kind of scenography that will allow us to do that. So with the 30 boxes of the Plateau archive and the 2 boxes from the archive of the architect, say something about the lack of what that archive isn't telling us. Voilà. So that's what I want to share with you.
So we've got time for some questions for Johan. Extraordinary range of sources, information and images about this one particular building. Are there anyone comment or question? Johan, I was going to ask about the building itself. You may have mentioned it, but I couldn't recall who was funding the building. It's the United Nations headquarters. Who's paying for it all?
That's a good question, and I don't have the answer to it yet. So again, it's I'm supposing money is coming partly from the United Nations itself. It will be partly coming from the Congolese government at the time. But again, we haven't been able. I mean, one of the tricky things of doing research on this field is that there was quite some archive still left in Kinshasa. The problem is knowing where it is and then having being able to have access to it. And so, like in the National Archives, I work quite a lot in the National Archives. It's very well inventorized for everything colonial, but not for what came in afterwards. And so that means that you have really difficulties of getting a sense sometimes of these kind of what you would think are being very accurate entities. So even in the Plateau archive, it's not something that you can really trace really like that. So where the money is really coming from, I couldn't actually tell. Yeah. So there are really a lot of silences still.
Because the reason to ask is that, you have the Jean Prouvé prefabricated roofing elements, the plywood, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's not inexpensive items either, even though they might be mass produced.
Yeah. No. Yeah, but I mean, you can see it also if you look at these kind of things. So these decorative panels were specifically made for this building.
in copper.
Yeah, and copper is, of course, I mean, from Mobutu, copper has this kind of, it's part of this recours à l'authenticity, because the first currency, you could say, in pre-colonial times were these copper crosses. And so for him, copper is a material with a very strong resonance of the legacy of the ancestors. And so you see it in a number of buildings where you have the roofing being very visibly done in copper. That's kind of showcasing national industry. So the big tower of the Jikamin, so the mining industry, which he has built along the main avenue in Kinshasa, that's cladded in the roof is cladded in copper as a kind of like a crown on top of the building. And you could say, I mean, where's the money coming from? I mean, Congo was rich because of the mining resources it had. So it was really a player on the global market at the time. And what you of course have, and that's the whole struggle that you see in the early 1960s, is that foreign investors and of course Belgian finance, which is massively present in Qatar during the colonial period, is trying to keep hold of that. And so Mobutu is of course the guy who succeeds in being very smart in positioning Kinshasa as a kind of global player, but also starting to make alliances with China in order to say to the Western powers, look guys, I mean, you're just one player in the world, and I'm going to see with whom I can make deals. And so it's not that it's a poor country. So you could say a lot of what I've been talking about. So this is late 60s, early 70s. So national economy is thriving at the time. It starts to plummet the moment Mobutu nationalizes industry, which is 73. So it kicks out all foreign experts and investors, and that's where all of a sudden there's a huge economic crisis, because all of a sudden certain expertise of how you run businesses gone. But so when this building was built, there was still massive money available, and so you see some projects that didn't make it to the finishing stage, which have been standing unfinished in Kinshasa for decades. Like the big tower you saw, that one was never finished. So there's a huge raw concrete monster, but then the interior is never with no tracking for that.
Yes, Karen.
You could look in the UN archives as well.
Yes.
But I mean, this is a perfect opportunity to think about the Cold War context, I think, because this is the UN establishing itself in a landscape where they're very worried about competition from Eastern Europe. So would you like to talk a bit about the Cold War?
Yeah, I think it's crucial to understand. Yeah, so what you have is of course, I mean, and that's, I mean, that one book that I showed is discussing that. So Congo, you could say, is like an extreme laboratory for global politics at the time, because I mean, we shouldn't forget the uranium that was used for the atomic bomb came out of Congo. So it's a resource that you find behind it. So it's like one of those. I mean, in 1906, there's a Belgian geologist who described the Congo as a geological scandal because it just fits everything. I mean, and it continues until today. So I also spoke about it recently. So if you take your mobile phone and you would dismantle it, you'd find built on, and where is coltan coming from? The eastern part of Congo. So, I mean, what you have today in the eastern part of Congo is a huge amount of informal mining going on. And so, how come that Rwanda is one of the global sellers of coltan while it doesn't have coltan on its territory? So it's, I mean, it's extracting coltan from the eastern part of Congo, and I mean, what is the international community doing about it? So, I mean, so Congo really has a problem of being a geological scandal, hence the international, about the outside interest in the country is so huge that nobody wants a very strong government, because strong government would renegotiate all the concessions. I mean, in Katanga, I mean, what is an interesting site to be in Lubumbashi, so the mining city, is the waiting, the departure hall of the airport. Because if you're sitting there, you see how global economy today works. So you'll see a Chinese businessman talking to an often Australian guy working in the mining industry, saying, hello, is this a problem that these planes like take so long to take off? And the Australian guy says, don't worry, they're just overloading the planes, but they always make it. So these kind of, I mean, this is the kind of thing that shows you how certain global economy works. And maybe just to the UN archives, I've been to the UN archives once, not for this building, for another one. I found it very hard to get to the really nitty-gritty stuff in the archive. So I found like a lot of reports and things. So I was looking at the school within the 1950s, which was the first interracial secondary school in the region. And so the United Nations and UNESCO was very interested in this kind of pedagogical experiment. And so I found the reports of the official reports of the missions that went there, but I didn't find like the documents that would show you behind the scenes of this. So that was my first encounter with the UN archives, which is also like 25 years ago.
Look, it seems like a giant project based on a building.
Yeah.
And so how do you, as a historian, bring it to a conclusion? I mean, is there going to be a book on the building? But how come you've sort of set out all of these gigantic lines of inquiry? And I think that many of us who do history, have to select. And mostly our selections are made by the opportunities we have. We can't get to the archival. So how will you pull it to? Is this going to be a multi-volume work on a single building?
No, I mean it's much more challenging. It's going to be small. No. I mean, yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, what I'm showing you is like, I mean, this is something that I put together in order to convince the archive that we should do an exhibit on. But I don't want it to be a huge, because they have a huge space, and I actually want it to be in a very small room. So I think it's about having like a couple of lines which are very concise, but show the kind of unexpected kind of narratives. And showing, I mean, what for me is important in this, the reason why I want to do it in this particular archive is because it used to be an institution that was quite conventional in the way it worked with its archive. It has a new artistic director who's great, Nicolas. So he's very open to this idea. And so what I think what we need to do is to show the documents that nobody would in the past have paid attention to. And so these bons de commande are a good example of that. So that you take this one banal document of the formwork and all of a sudden speak about document. So it's like bringing a couple of items in that exhibit that would show, I mean, and that's what I like about Thomas van Leeuwen, so that he starts from these little things and all of a sudden you see something swelling, and then it becomes, of course, this massive monster that you can no longer control. So I think doing an exhibit will be a good exercise of really deciding what is really crucial. And so
at the same time, Johan, though, you've been constantly publishing on these little strands out of it. So in some respects, I wonder whether that's the strategy. You don't produce the definitive book, but you're producing multiple strands of research output.
So I mean, what for me has been a turning point, we did a paper on the roof for the construction history conference. And so it was by finding these bons de commande where all of a sudden started, we should actually do a paper on this bacot de portant as kind of counterpiece. And so in that sense, I mean, I think it works as a talk because it's like, it puts all the stuff out there.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's the problem why I haven't written many books, because I like to do talks and I give you the goal of what is in there. And then, making it to the book is too tough. But I like doing exhibitions because exhibitions allow you to, I mean, to then again tell a number of these stories and unsettle basically the visitor. I mean, that's what I think a good exhibition needs to do, is like, and for a particular audience, because the audience that comes now to the CIDRA is very captive for this kind of thing. So the Still Congo exhibit was also there. And it was a really critical kind of reading of Art Nouveau and the link with colonial history. at the moment in time when Brussels was having this, I don't know how many anniversary of the Art Nouveau. And so it was a big European project with a lot of money. And so they did a kind of cultural exhibition. So I think these kind of things are a way of doing that.
So any other question? No, thank you. So Johan, thank you very much. Thank you.